And the positives might sound a bit banal, but I think a lot of personal pride in the fact that I was of service to a country. You know, I wear 3 medals as a result of it, with pride.
Were the Australians using defoliants?
No, but we were victims of them, I'm quite sure. And of all the naval people I've talked to who were involved with troop transport, they say we took them up as boys and we brought them home as old men. And you could see, they could see that change in 12 months.
Did you feel proud to be part of the Australian?
Sure did.
Specifically, why?
Because I felt that I'd done what my country asked me to do. And I did it well.
So, you've successfully escaped the claws of school. You've done well in your training. You've moved into a police service and are respected by your peers and your community, and you're finding a time in your life where you're getting settled, and then you're drafted. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I was initially drafted in New Zealand. They had a national service ballot as well as we did. I'm not sure whether it applied to every 20-year-old over there or whether it was, again, a randomly chosen thing. But the deal was you had to do 3 months national service, and I've since learnt that what they were trying to do then was to keep people in the army. So they would say, look, you've done 3 months training, we'll send you to Malaya. You know, they were making it sound very attractive to stay in the army, and a lot of people did. The thought of having to leave the police force and go off and do 3 months training for the New Zealand Army wasn't very appealing. And at the time when I got this call-up notice, I said, oh, it's all right, I'll be able to work my way out of this one because I'm not a New Zealand citizen. But before that happened, I got a letter from my mother saying that saying oddly enough, that initially she had received a letter from a friend of mine, a former police cadet, who was working in a place called Banana in Queensland, and we were born on the same day, and he had written to my mother from Banana and said, I have just received my call-up papers. I imagine Stephen will have been called up as well. Now, I did have an exemption form. If you'd left the country in that year of your 19th birthday, you could get a form saying, well, I'm exempt from national service whilst I'm out of the country. But if you came back to the country, you then had to let them know you were back. And so, based on that information, I felt obliged to come back to Australia to let them know that I was available for national service.
So the reference to your friend in Banana is because they were doing it on birth dates?
Yes. It was a fairly iniquitous system whereby they just kept drawing marbles out with a date of birth on it. So anybody born on the 12th of November 1946 had to face up to the office. And the more people they wanted, as the war escalated, the more marbles they drew. But it was, you can imagine, I mean, there were no females in it, so you can imagine trying to do something like that today. Equal rights. Aboriginals were exempt, as were serving members of the armed forces. So 65,000 of us had our names pulled out of a barrel, if you like.
So you'd made a decision that if you were going to war, you were going to go to war for Australia.
Yeah, I don't think you actually think about going to war. You think, well, I will do my conscription. I mean, obviously, I'd send plenty of my mates go away for a couple of years and do it, and it's very much the Australian thing to do.
So you weren't expecting war as an end result of that? This was just something you were doing?
I wouldn't have even known where Vietnam was then, I don't think. It was something you read in the paper. When you're 19, and unless things are affecting you personally, you just don't even think about them. And I'm sure that hasn't changed. Although we are more conscious today, and perhaps because of Vietnam, that there is a social conscience.
So you came back, and how many months were you expecting to be doing with the army?
Well, you had to get into it first, so you had to pass a medical, which I did, and they said, well, you'll be drafted, you'll be going in on the 9th intake of national servicemen in July 1967. I'd come back in April, so I went and worked for my father for 3 months, which reminded me of all the things why I didn't ever want to go work for him. And on the 12th of July 1967, I went to Puckapunyal, started my 2 years of national service. I mean, that was obligatory. Once you were in for 2 years. You couldn't make a choice about how long you were there for.
Can you tell us about Puckapunyal?
No, not very much. I remember it was cold. We flew there in a DC-3 aircraft, and then landed at, I think, sort of Seymour or somewhere like that, somewhere in northern Victoria or central Victoria, and they took us there in a truck. We lived in barracks accommodation, again very not dissimilar to what I'd experienced in the police force, both here and in New Zealand, perhaps closer to the New Zealand experience because we had big barracks there rather than two-room little two-man huts. A lot of discipline there, running around, getting up very early, just really trying to knock the stuffing out of you, just so that you could become acclimatised to the army way of life. The reason I don't remember much about it is I wasn't there for very long. I was only there for I think 2 weeks, and then I went to officer school after that.
So you went to officer school. Was this your choice?
Yeah. Well, obviously you had to qualify to get there, and I made quite an effort to make sure that I was capable of getting there. I wasn't up to their education spec, although I was just inside it, having passed my 3rd year of high school. Yeah, I wanted to prove I could get there. I didn't particularly care if I was an officer or not. And after I'd been there about 2 days, I decided I definitely didn't want to be one. And so ultimately wasn't. But funny experience. Again, you get there and they make you run everywhere, and just again the discipline thing. You will conform to our standard of discipline. Stuff really that I'd done at 16 and at 20, you sort of think, well, this is a bit ho-hum, but you know the ropes, and so it's pretty easy to fall in line with it. They had a senior class, and we were the junior class, and you have a mentor from the senior class. Some of those people were people I wouldn't have considered leadership material, but just perhaps by dint of educational qualification they were there, and I perhaps didn't have as much respect for them as I should have. But after 3 or 4 days there, they invited us into the mess for the first time, just the officers' mess, or the junior officers' mess. And we sort of had to parade past this senior class, and they were all there in their finery, and we're dragged in. And one of my very best friends from school was standing there as a member of the senior class, with his hands behind his back, and so I got to him, hello lads, how are you? And he didn't say a thing. He just looked at me, and I thought, I don't want to be part of that. I'm not like that. He wasn't ever like that. If that's what the system had done to him, then I wasn't going to stay there for any longer than I had to.
So you felt like the way this officer training was organised was very exclusive and hierarchical, and
very much so. Yeah, good call. And it was turning people into something that they weren't, and that's not how you manage men at all. You've got to manage people at their level, not from another level. They have to respect you, but they can respect you at your level without you elevating yourself above it, I believe. within a couple of weeks we had the opportunity to meet the Colonel Commandant and what do you think, what are you expecting from the army and all that. And I said, I'm expecting to get out when my time's up, and I'd be quite happy if I wasn't here. And the threat was that if you didn't stay, they'd send you back to Puckapunyal, but you'd have to wait for the next course to start back there, which would be another 2 months, 2.5 months, and you'd be peeling potatoes or something banal like that for that period. So they encourage you to stay for 3 months, and with the option at that stage, you can then go to the corps of your choice. And so I said, that's fine, I'll come back in 3 months. And I did.
And so you went back to the corps that you had been in?
No. I'd not been in any corps. I'd only ever been in a recruit training battalion. But, during the course of that 3 months, we visited infantry establishments, artillery establishments. We played sport against other units, and so we travelled around a bit. And because I used to surf, I absolutely fell in love with the School of Artillery, which was positioned at North Head in Manly. And so when they finally let me go, I said I want to go to the School of Artillery. So I went there.
What did you know about Vietnam at this stage? You think you probably couldn't have found it on a map?
No.
But what did you know about what was going on over there?
Absolutely nothing. Just knew that we had troops there.
Did you know why?
No, just the threat of communism, probably, because that's what they used to. That was a sort of the Menzies fear that they used to run through us. The red peril, the yellow peril is coming, and that communism was just going to, like a big domino theory that was just going to keep knocking down countries until it got to Australia, and that if we didn't go up there and meet it head on, then it was going to get us. And fear factor.
Did you believe that?
Well, we'd been, no, probably not, but I mean, what's fear to a 20-year-old? I mean, as it turned out, at 21, in the company of all your mates, and it doesn't take you long to make mates, because we're all, well, not all, but a third of us were national servicemen. There's a commonality about what you're doing, and you're bulletproof. No one's going to get you.
How long does that take to set in?
5 minutes. The fear when you first land, sort of at Nui Dat, which was the centre of where the bulk of our troops were. It was our task force headquarters in Phuoc Tuy province. You don't know if you're going to get off a plane and people are firing shots, or there'll be artillery fire or whatever. But Nui Dat was a very secure base for Australians in 1968. During the Battle of Long Tan, which was very close by in 1966, it was deemed to be vulnerable, so they reinforced it more and more. During the Tet Offensive in 1967, it was again deemed vulnerable, so they reinforced it more. And so by the time, the Tet Offensive in 68, when by the time we got there, it felt secure. I mean, nobody knows how vulnerable we were, but nobody knows who the enemy was either. So.
What did you pack? What did you take with you?
I only took army clothes. I think one civilian shirt, which ironically we were asked to wear. We flew up with Qantas. We flew from Sydney to Darwin, had a couple of hours in Darwin, and Darwin to Singapore. And the Singapore government didn't wish to be seen to be aiding the war effort, so they said, well, we should look like civilians. So we all took our green shirts off, put our white Palaco shirts on, and walked into Changi Airport for a couple of hours, had breakfast there. And of course, nobody would have seen our green pants and jungle boots and realised that we weren't soldiers. Got back on the plane, put our green shirts on, and then kept going. Flew to Saigon, hung around there for a couple of hours, then flew to Nui Dat.
Did you take any photographs or?
Not at that stage. Don't think I'd ever taken a photo in my life then. And again, remember the period, it's the 60s, mum and dad might have had a box brownie up above the stove or something, and that was the camera. Every couple of years you'd see 12 little black and white photos and you'd remember Christmas Day or a picnic on the beach. Cameras weren't a disposable item like they are today, or anywhere near as accessible. However, first payday, when you've got a few dollars left and you don't know what you're going to do with it, and you go to the PX, which is the government-run supermarket, if you like, you could buy a Kodak Instamatic camera with a roll of slide film for about $4. And that included processing. So that's what most people bought the very first time they went to the PX. And because we were somewhere which was new and different, and there was a different culture there, and there were statues and people living in fairly ordinary conditions, if you had a camera, you took photos of it. And when the slide, they're all slides, thankfully, because colour print film hadn't really been developed at that stage. When you got your slides back, you sort of had a little slide night in your tent or wherever, and because you'd then gone and bought a slide projector from the PX with your next pay. And that's a good photo, that's nice, and you just, so then you'd send the photos home, and with a little inscription with them, and so that people at home could look at them if they wanted to. Then you came home and bored everyone to death with them. But there must have been millions of photographs taken in Vietnam, and most people, after that sort of the use-by date of the Instamatic was, oh hell, he's got a better camera than me, because guys would go on R&R to Hong Kong or Bangkok and come back with a Pentax camera or a Praktica or a Canon, which took better photos. Had single lens reflex cameras then. Pentax had invented the first camera, or their first camera, with an inbuilt light meter, so you could take some pretty good photos. And most of us came home with a good camera.
Can you tell us about the PX?
Yeah, it's just a big tin shed like every other army shed. Very strictly policed against lots of things actually kept behind wire cages. If you wanted it, someone had to come along with a key and unlock it to get perhaps an Akai tape recorder, or a reel-to-reel tape or whatever out. You could buy anything in the PX: chocolate bars, cameras, clothes, silk, all the things that you'd want to send home to your family, perhaps, postcards. But they only ever let about 20 people in at a time, so there'd always be this huge line out the front, and as one person came out, they'd let another one in. And, it's good. It was just, from the outside, it was just another army shed, but inside it was like Disneyland.
And it was run by the army?
Yeah, probably, in hindsight, probably by the Americans. We were paid in US dollars, but the money was converted to what they called MPC, which was military payment certificates. And the reason for that was so that there'd be no black marketing going on. If you had an American dollar, you could do lots of things in a village, for example. You can buy a lot of things with American money. So the only money they ever gave us were these certificates.
So we're just catching up with what we were speaking about before, about the kind of money that was used in Vietnam. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yes, we were paid in US dollars from memory, and but the currency we received was a monopoly style of money called MPC, which was a military payment certificate. And the reason for that was there's a tremendous amount of black marketing sort of tends to get generated in most wartime situations, and people accumulate wealth, and the US dollar was a very handy currency to be doing that with. So in order to prevent civilians getting hold of US currency, we dealt with this paper money, if you like. And but then in order to stop us from becoming wealthy by perhaps gambling or selling things to the local people, they used to quite frequently say, okay, at 2400 hours, 2 days from now, there's a new issue of currency. So what you had to do was take all the money you had to the paymaster, and he would count it and replace it with the new issue, which was a different colour, same currency but a different colour, and then that became the only currency that you could trade with. So if people had been running an illegal booking, betting sort of shop or whatever, and they'd accumulated several hundred or even thousands of dollars, or in that currency, they'd go to the paymaster and he'd say, well, you haven't earned that much, so you've obviously earned this money illegally, and they would only pay them out perhaps as much as they had earned in that time. So those people had sort of passed the money off to all their mates and say, can you get rid of this for me? But I'd say by and large it probably worked.
And was that through with the Americans as well?
Oh yes, that was their currency. So we were under their auspices in that area. One of my mates, Jens Smith, Jens went up quite early in the piece with UNRWA in 1965, and of course that was pre-decimal currency. So Jens's paybook was in pounds, shillings, and pence when he went to Vietnam. Whilst in Vietnam, he was being paid in US dollars, and when he came home from Vietnam, he was being paid in Australian dollars. So he had one paybook with 3 different currencies in it.
How much did you get paid?
Not very much. I think we got about $7 a day, plus $1.55 a day region allowance or war allowance or whatever you'd like to call it. We didn't have to pay tax on it. And while $7 a day doesn't sound very much, you've got to remember back in 1968 it was probably about as much as anybody was earning. So I don't think any of us thought we were underpaid.
And was your wife working back home?
Yes, she worked, and being married, they used to take, I think 60% of your salary would automatically be debited to her bank account. That was to prevent soldiers from drinking their salaries or gambling them or wasting them on other things. So when I came home, even though I was only away for 6 months, we actually had accumulated a reasonable little nest egg.
Did you feel like you were very different cultures when you were over there, the Americans and the Australians?
Yeah, that's a good point. They're not. I don't know if I would have titled it as cultures. We just felt as soldiers we were much better soldiers, and I think time has proven that theory to be correct. They had a fun, we all got paid fortnightly, and the Americans, every American got a carton of cigarettes given to him on payday, whether he smoked or not, which just, the absolute waste of money, and obviously, and how many of those poor buggers have died of lung cancer since bears, warrants thinking about, but. And so, of course, the people who didn't smoke would then use their cigarettes for bartering, or they'd take them into town and barter with the locals. And so that's sort of black marketing in its own little way. That was one of the things. They used to sort of, out in the bush, you'd hear them, they'd have radios, or they'd have, radios with Armed Forces Vietnam, Good Morning Vietnam playing. He was real, that guy. And they'd have potato chips, and you could hear the potato chip packets, and they'd put aftershave on, you could smell them. And they were all the things we were taught not to do. And we prided ourselves on being very good at what we were trained to do.
Did you have any personal dealings with Americans?
We had an American, what they were called the Husky Alpha unit, which was it was a battery of 155 mobile howitzers right next door to us. We were a howitzer unit ourselves, but we were a smaller one. And so we used to sort of go and take photos of these guns firing, and we used to hang around and talk to the people when they weren't firing. They were all just human beings, or individuals. They've all got wives and children and girlfriends, and the same problems that everybody else had in the world. as individuals, but collectively they became a rabble, I thought.
How do you mean?
Oh, they're very loud. When they're in a bar situation, they try to talk over the top of each other, and it just gets noisier and noisier, and it's a real male thing.
Were the interactions, in your opinion, between the Australians and the Vietnamese much different from the way that Americans seem to interact with the local culture?
I don't know that I'd be qualified to answer that. I think we were probably more sympathetic to the local people, and I mean today you would think that because we almost feel we're in the same region, but then there was no such thing. I mean, they were a world away for us. I think we're a more humane group of people in a military situation.
What do you base that on?
I think we were better trained, and I think that we had been, particularly at Canungra, which was a great experience. We'd been taught to respect their culture, perhaps more so than the Americans had. The Americans, I think, I mean, I'm not bagging Americans, but I think they sort of tend to see themselves as the all-conquering heroes, we'll put the flag up and everyone will surrender. We were there to do a job and we did it.
Going back again, when you were drafted, was the anti-war sentiment already emerging at that time?
It probably was. And again, because of your upbringing, you tend to sort of look at that and say, it's a communist minority, or there's always going to be anti this. People are always going to be anti something, and this is the movement that's anti-war. Historically, I think they had a bloody good case, but at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing, and honestly, I didn't meet anyone in Vietnam who disagreed with us being in Vietnam. I know we've probably all got bigger social consciences today than we might have had then, but we were still living in the shadow of our fathers and their wartime experiences. Your grandfather did his bit, son, and I did my bit, now it's your turn, and that's what you felt. And you all whinged and complained about the weather, or bugger, I've got to go out to a fire support base for a couple of days. That's going to be uncomfortable, but you did it. And we were just, whether we were right or wrong, I mean, history I would suggest says that we were wrong, that the war was wrong, but we believe we were doing the right thing at the time, and we did it very well.
So that, when you went over there, you were a young man, as obviously so many were. What were your politics at that time?
They would have been those of my parents. I wouldn't have voted Labor. So that's and it was a Liberal government that sent us there. So that reinforces the belief that you're doing the right thing.
You seem to have had a bit of a rebellious streak, or a questioning streak as a youngster. So then, how did you react to being told you had to go?
That rebellious streak was knocked out of me in the police force. I mean, that straightened you out, and it just put everything in perspective. And what I learned in the police force just held me in great stead in the army. I mean, you could join the army and probably still do it today, and as long as you run everywhere, nobody would even ask what you were doing, because they would assume you were doing something. You could work the system pretty smartly if you wanted to.
And you were sent over by yourself, separate from your unit that you trained with. So you're on a plane. Can you talk us through that? You're on this plane going to Vietnam. Well, perhaps just leading up to that,
I was on an exercise at, I think, Shoalwater Bay at the time that a telex came through saying that I had to go up. they did this to lots of other national servicemen. I mean, it wasn't just me. I mean, they used to pick us up at random and, as I say, plug holes everywhere. I had to fly back to Brisbane, which was quite funny because being on an exercise, I was in full battle gear. Somebody drove me to Rockhampton Airport, and where a ticket was provided. Flew to Brisbane's Eagle Farm Airport, which in those days was just old Nissen huts. Got off the plane with a rifle, caught a taxi home. Didn't have any money because you weren't allowed to take money out of these exercises because you'd gamble it and that would cause fights. So and my wife had to pay for the taxi when it got there. The next day I had to go back to our barracks in Inogra, handle my gear in and my rifle, and then had a week's leave. And in that week I had to drive back to Adelaide, say goodbye to everybody, and then went to Sydney. They flew me to Sydney and they had I think it was called Eastern Command Holding Depot or something, where you, other people like myself who were going up as individuals effectively, all just stayed in this place until they had enough of us to fill a plane. And we were there for 9 or 10 days. And I don't remember anything about that, but I have a guy who's recently contacted me who's got a photo of us the night we left there, and I sort of remembered that a bit. You know, he had a clock in the background, and the plane left at 10, and I think it was about 9:20, and we were having our last beer before we got on the plane, and so he remembered it quite clearly. And we flew, and it was a Qantas 707V jet, and it flew to Darwin. We got to Darwin about 2 o'clock in the morning and stepped out of the plane, and it was steamy. Sydney had been freezing cold, and it was just up there, the humidity was very much like what we had to get used to. And we spent a couple of hours in Darwin, then we flew, as I said, to Singapore, which is probably about a 6-hour flight from Darwin in one of those planes in those days. That was in itself, I mean, my parents had been to Singapore. They used to talk about Singapore. So, you know, wow, I'm in Singapore, you know. I remember getting off there very early in the morning, about, I don't know, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, I suppose it must have been. And there's this horrible smell. And somebody in the airport explained that you get this sort of mist comes in at night over Singapore and just sits there until the sea breeze blows it away, and all the garbage smells get trapped underneath it. And so that's my first recollection of the East, if you like. It was this terrible smell. And we had breakfast there with our white shirts on, and then flew to Saigon. Again, I mean, you're just sitting in a plane, which I'd done before. I mean, I'd flown a bit, and I'd flown to New Zealand and back, and flown inside Australia. So there was no real strange experience there. Landing in Saigon was a real eye-opener, because you're sort of right out of the plane, you know, you're here, and that's Ton Son Nhut Airport. It was the airport then. Saigon's now called Ho Chi Minh City. So, and the Americans, that was one of their largest Air Force bases. It was I think it was either the third or the fourth busiest airport in the world at the time, but only because of the fighter jets that were landing and refuelling or rearming and taking off. But every time a plane landed there, they used to have these big choppers called sky cranes, and underneath them they had a tank full of anti-inflammatory chemicals. And so every time something landed, they would come in over the top of it in case it crashed, and they could immediately douse the fire. And so there's all these sky cranes, sort of scary, the things you see today putting out fires, like Elvis, the big fire thing. That's a sky crane. And but I also saw a B-52 bomber land. That was the first and possibly the only one I'd ever seen land. And the airstrip, I think, was about 3 kilometres long, and this thing landed down the end, and through the heat haze it was just coming at us, and their wings dropped 6 feet from flight position to resting position, and they actually put props underneath them to stop because they're so heavy. And just watching this thing come through the haze with its wings dropping, that's a vivid memory. of Tonsinite. And then they put us in a Hercules aircraft, and we got in a queue, and we sat in that thing for about 2 hours before we cleared to take off. There was just so many planes. There's a plane landing or taking off, I think, every 40 seconds. It's just absolutely amazing. I think Chicago airport and JFK airport were the only two airports busier at that time than Tonsinite. Perhaps Heathrow too.
What were you thinking? I mean, this is really just... What were you thinking you'd got yourself into?
Well, I honestly couldn't remember, and probably wasn't thinking much anyway. It's just, as you don't. I mean, again, you're there with all these guys that you've become, you've sort of learnt to know in the last couple of weeks. You're all going somewhere different, but at that point you're all in the same place. I don't know, you're just sort of thinking, hell, I wonder what's going on, but...
You don't remember any element of fear?
No, not at all. And again, you sort of, you're in the army, so you're doing what you're told, and so you don't have to think. You're taught not to think. It's better if you don't think.
And then when you arrived at the place that you were stationed,
yeah,
what were your impressions when you first got there?
I can remember getting off the plane and wondering, as I think I said earlier, whether anyone was going to be shooting, because we were right in the heart of it. Once it was established that no one was shooting me, and somebody was there in a truck expecting me, and they said, I'll take you to where you're going. We were a 10-minute ride in a truck to where our unit was encamped. Made myself known in the orderly room. Oh, yeah, there's a spare bed. The bloke whose place you're taking slept in Kershaw's tent. You can go and find that. And I haven't got a clue who Kershaw is. And so that's it. And you wander out, then come back to the orderly room, or come back to the quartermaster, get a weapon issued to you, and some webbing and stuff, like packs and belts and whatever, and lots of uniforms, not brand new ones. Just, and we probably had, I don't know, 8 or 9 sets of pants and shirts, because you'd wear 3 or 4 a day. It was just, the humidity would just drain you. And every day, Kershaw was the laundry man. He was my roommate. And you used to, with a texture colour, you'd write your number. They had a laundry number, and you'd write that on the back of the trousers and the back of the shirt, and you just throw them in a big bag. And he used to take them into Berea, and the local people used to launder them, and he'd bring back yesterday's lot, and so there was always clean laundry there for you. There was a bed. My trunk had arrived with me. We all had a big metal trunk. I don't know how that got there, but I don't even know what was in it. We did have polyesters, which were those sort of khaki-coloured walking out outfits. So we would have had a set of those in there, and probably underclothes and things, but and maybe one set of civilian clothes. And a bed, just a bed with a mosquito net over it, and it's all sandbagged around the wall. We had electricity. We had duck boards, rats, and God knows what used to live underneath it, and snakes and things. And you'd sort of, your friends would send you up, or your relatives would send you up a tin of nuts, and even then they had pull tops in them, and you could put a plastic sealer over the top of it, and you'd wake up in the morning, the rats had eaten through the plastic and eaten all your nuts, which was never much fun. Had a tent. There was 4 of us in the tent. Shorty Pierce was one, and a guy called Bob Rayner. Bob was a truck driver. Shorty was an FO, which is a forward observer, which is an artilleryman attached to infantry. So he was frequently, most often, out in the bush. And Kirsch was the laundryman. So, my role was predominantly, I was clerical, so I worked in the orderly room, or occasionally went out and replaced people who might have had a couple of days leave owing, and just took their place on a gun, but I didn't really know very much about guns. But I was there to make up the numbers. The biggest responsibility I had was on the last Sunday of every month. They used to come in and they used to change codes, and for the FO party had a signaller, and the signaller used to call back gun positions to the gun crews and say, fire here, fire there. But they had to talk. They had to give the positions they were firing to in a code, which was just, they were firing to a grid reference, and they, on a daily basis, they changed the way they referred to a particular grid reference. And I used to type those out and then print them, then destroy the master, and the FO SIG bombardier, Dennis Hend, then used to go back out in the bush and distribute them to all the other signallers. And he told me, I saw him in October last year, and he said, he reminded me that we used to do this, because I'd actually forgotten it, but as soon as he reminded me, I could visualise myself typing these things. And he told me that when he took them back out to the bush, the guys would say, who typed them out? And he said, if I told them you did, they'd say, good, we know they're right. And I guess that was my contribution to the Vietnam War.
It's actually a fairly big one.
Well, in hindsight, it probably is too. And I'm certainly, I'm very proud to have been reminded of it, because I've spent a lot of my life thinking I didn't do anything up there, but knowing that I'd done that, it may well have impacted somewhere.
And when you looked around the base, what age groups are we talking?
Oh, fairly diverse. A lot of young people. Most of the Nashos were 21 or 22, but some of the regulars were younger than that, and quite a few of them were older. There were plenty of 40-year-olds there who probably looked pretty old to us then, because that's about how old our parents would have been. There were lots of Korean War veterans fighting up there, regular soldiers who had fought in Malaya, Borneo, professional soldiers. So quite a mix, but predominantly, certainly sitting here at 57, predominantly younger people, obviously.
So you've got a group of young boys in a foreign country all together. In any other circumstances, it sounds like it would be a fabulous time.
Yeah, I didn't say it wasn't.
Do you want to talk about the good side of it?
Well, I think predominantly it was largely good all the time. My unit, as I say, and I was in Headquarter Battery, 12th Field Regiment. My unit had fought at Coral, had lost 2 of its members, and had seen others wounded and flown back to Australia. That would be a lasting bad memory for all those people, and I'm particularly glad I wasn't there at the time, because it was a vicious assault. It also involved cavalry and engineers and infantry people as well, so it wasn't only our unit that was at the Battle of Coral. But beyond that, the nights were fun. We had a movie every night in the camp. Beer costs 10 cents a can or 12 cents a can. Cigarettes were at 10 cents a packet. We all, I can't remember anybody who didn't smoke in those days or drink. Some of the guys possibly developed drinking disorders as a result of beer being so readily available. We played cards at night, we played games, somebody bought a thing on how to play a guitar, and you could buy a guitar in Berea for $5 and hope that it wouldn't fall to pieces before you got it home, and or back to camp. And so the guy who sort of paid $20 for his guitar lessons would sell them for $10 to the next bloke, and so we were always doing something. We played volleyball every afternoon when we were in camp. There was a lot of camaraderie, there were a few fights, you know, as you'd always get, and but by and large, they were pretty good times. It's a bit like being on a football trip, if I may seem so flippant. You know, lots of guys, lots of bravado, lots of testosterone, lots of laughter. I mean, Australia, you can't put that many Australians in one place together and not have funny things happen.
And in the camp where you were, was there a mix of men who were going out to the front lines?
Yes.
And the people in the support facilities?
Yes, all mixed together, and no real animosity between any of them. We're all up there doing something different. The guys who were going out from the battalions, I mean, effectively everybody was supporting our battalions, as they always have done, and we had 9 battalions up there, of whom 1 to 7 did 2 tours, and 8 and 9 did 1, and they were great soldiers, and they put up with an awful lot of horrible things, which I'm glad I didn't have to do. But then when they came back in, they wanted to be paid. They wanted to have their R&R or their R&C. They needed blankets on their bed. They needed a truck driver to take them somewhere. They wanted to be fed. They needed to be nursed. So all of those people, they say for every person in the field, there are 7 people behind them. And so it's a big team game. And that respect was there.
What did you perceive any differences when they came back in after being away? The faces, the way they carried themselves. Did you pick up a sense?
We tended to be very secular. Like our group was here, their group was there. When they came in, that's where they stayed. You might see them. You might intermingle with them at a concert, perhaps, but again, all you're looking at is a guy with a pair of greens on, usually no shirt, he's got a weapon in his hand, sitting on a chair. He could be anybody. He could be a dentist clerk, he could be a dentist, you know, he could be a medic. You couldn't tell who was who. There were no distinguishing signs.
So you didn't have occasions when you'd be walking past someone and you would look at them and think, oh, they've been through hell? Did people cover that stuff up pretty well?
I think they probably covered it up pretty well, and a lot of them did go through hell. You see it more now. You can pick them now a lot easier than you could pick them then. I love what the Navy guys say, because the Navy contributed hugely to that conflict, and they took about 16,000 troops up there, and of all the naval people I've talked to who were involved with troop transport, they say we took them up as boys and we brought them home as old men. And you could see, they could see that change in 12 months.
But you didn't see that? I suppose you were right in the middle of it.
Well, you are, and as I say, I mean, we, in our artillery regiment, in our particular part of Nui Dat, were fairly well removed from the battalions. There was always 2 battalions up there, and both of the battalions that were there whilst I was there were camped well away from us. I would have seen them, but I couldn't have distinguished them.
And did you think at times, how would I deal with, if I was in their situation, if I had to do that, how would I deal with it?
No, not at all. I would have, if they'd said, you've got to go out and do it, I just would have gone and done it, I feel sure. And you don't walk around thinking that. I mean, you're up there thinking, well, I'm doing what I've been asked to do as well as I can. If they ask me to do something else, I'll do that as well as I can. But you're sort of secretly glad you're not in an infantry battalion.
You must have heard a lot of stories when you were there about what was going on.
Some, not a lot. The Shorty Pearson, who shared the tent with us, he was probably closer to the thick of things than any of us at that time, and but he was given to sort of having flights of fantasy, I think, and about cutting off ears of bodies and things like that, and you never knew whether to believe him or not.
Was it more convenient not to believe him?
I don't like the thought of cutting off anybody's ears, dead or alive. So, no, it was better not to.
But still as a relatively, young man, then you must have heard things that shocked you.
Probably hear more now. People didn't talk about it a lot, because again, you've just been thrust into that situation and you figure that's what you're up there to do, whatever it is that they were doing. I hear more things now from guys who say, "God, we went through this village and and so opened fire and I reckon we killed 6 people and they were just kids or they were women or whatever." But we covered it up and we sort of kept going. And, I'm being hypothetical, but people, it's coming back to haunt people a lot more now than perhaps it did at the time. And I can understand that. I think the worst thing I heard, but again, it was only recently, was a friend of mine who was at the Battle of, he wasn't at the Battle of Longtown, he was with 6th Battalion, but his company wasn't the company that was engaged. But the next day his company went out with engineers and they dug pits to bury the remaining dead, because the Vietnamese used to come and take their dead, and it was a sign of respect. We always left their dead and let them come and take them, and when they'd taken what they could, we would bury the rest. And this chap went out and under a national serviceman and was instructed to help bury the dead, and the first person he touched, their arm came off in his hand, and he has recurring nightmares about that, and I'm sure I would too if that had happened to me. I mean, they're the horrible things about war. At the Battle of Coral, the things they don't talk about is the number of our tracked vehicles, our tanks and our APCs, that actually were running over dead people, and that parts of those dead people were getting caught up in the gearing of it, and they had to sanitise them afterwards, and some of them were almost unusable because of the smell that came with it. And they're the horrible things. The Anzac legend didn't mention blood and mud and tears.
And they're the things that stay with you, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And as I say, I have the greatest empathy for anybody who experienced that horror and finds it coming back to them today. And as it does, so many guys are suffering from PTSD, and whether it's pretty easy to say, "Oh, you're imagining it," but it happens to too many to believe that. It really does. And I think, I've got the greatest admiration for our First and Second World War veterans, and particularly our Korean War veterans, who all suffered the same thing, but were just told to get on with their lot, and they did. At least today we have some sort of social conscience, and we can perhaps deal with these things.
I was thinking too, what was your attitude towards the enemy? What were your thoughts about the Viet Cong?
I honestly, we didn't know who the enemy was. You never saw Viet Cong. The guys in the battalions did, but where I was, we didn't. And it was a funny war. It wasn't like the Germans are the ones with the grey uniforms and the funny helmets, and we're the other ones. If they weren't fighting under the banner of the South Vietnamese Army, the Viet Cong would infiltrate their villages. A lot of sort of little mind games and things, and threats and innuendo and cutthroats, and right, well, I'll cut your wife's throat if you don't come and fight for us tonight. And so the people you may have been trading with during the day may well have been out setting booby traps at night, or perhaps even armed. They were, historically, the North Vietnamese are a sensational group of soldiers. The tunnel systems they had, which ran over 400 kilometres, are just unique in the world. And when they've been fighting for 300 years anyway, and they knew a bit about the terrain. If we hadn't had helicopters up there, it would have been a very different war. And we just got to be thankful they didn't have helicopters. But an incredibly brave and patriotic group of people. You know, and they would do anything that they were told to do. Fierce competitors.
What did you think at the time, though?
I
Or what did you know?
I didn't know anything, and you believe. I mean, particularly you're in a base with 5,000 other people. There's all this. There's an American base there with probably $10 million worth of heavy artillery. Your Kiwi base next door with artillery. Our own batteries around us with artillery. There's 2 battalions of men, of whom at least probably half would be in camp at any one time. We've got choppers coming in. We've got American air support. You feel impregnable. You don't think about dying. You don't think about there's someone just over there might want to kill me. You just, your job today is to type up this report, or today you're relieving so-and-so at Fire Support Base Susan or wherever, and you just go and do it.
If you think about the different films that have come out about that time, are there any that you would say speak closely to your experience of Vietnam?
The 2 films that I think I admire most about Vietnam, one is Born on the 4th of July, mainly because it dealt with the aftermath much better than any of the others. And what's becoming a cult classic is The Odd Angry Shot, which when it was made was I would have rated it as an indifferent sort of movie about Vietnam. Today they show it in the War Memorial in their cinemas, and it is actually an exceptionally good film. Graham Kennedy telling a bloke who didn't want to be there, well, everybody has to be somewhere and you're bloody well here, so make the most of it. And whilst I wasn't in the SAS, which I believe his unit was portraying, it certainly brings across the camaraderie, all the feelings that we experienced there, or a lot of the feelings come out in that movie. Graham Kennedy was very good in it, actually. And it was probably, to be quite honest, when I saw it not long after coming home from Vietnam, and didn't think very much of it, but I've now got it on DVD and I love it.
Did the film Apocalypse Now speak to you at all?
No, it's rubbish. It's absolute crap. If that was anyone's Vietnam, I'll go he for touchy. But that another good one, very rare, very hard to find, The Boys from Company C, which basically talks of the futility, and it's a young group of guys go through the American system, get to Vietnam and rouse, get on that truck, you're taking this convoy up to the general, and they sort of fight their way through an eternity, and they finally get there, and what they've been taking is ice cream and cigarettes to the general, and they've lost 3 of their mates along the way, and that's actually quite a good movie. But Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, the social elements of that I liked. De Niro played a great character in that, coming home and where they used to drink in that hall all the time, and then he just couldn't bring himself to go back in there because no one was going to really understand what he'd been through. I thought they played that pretty good. But Tom Cruise in Born on the 4th of July, brilliant film.
I've seen in some of, in fact, your work, and in some of the photography, that uniform didn't look like it was getting worn in the way in which it had been intended a heck of a lot over there.
Yeah,
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, not in the Vietnam environment, because it was exceptionally humid. We were working in the tropics. Sometimes it would rain. You could get an inch of rain in an hour, and be somewhere where you couldn't get shelter, and then 5 minutes later it would be dry, humid, and your clothes were just drying on top of you, and so it just depends on the situation. And that situation wasn't good for. I mean, you didn't have shiny boots and pressed clothes.
Are there any occasions on which you did have to?
Yeah, we did. When we, just before we came home, we had a handover where we handed over to the unit that was taking our place, and we had a big parade for that, and we had to polish our boots, and I think we put our black belts on rather than our normal webbing ones. Probably wore our slouch hats, and we would have found the best pair of clothes that we had.
And they were sort of the best pair out of the second-hand lot you were given on arrival?
Yeah. You always had your favourites. The Americans had their pants were slightly tapered, and they always found that they were slightly lighter material than ours, and they were good to wear, and they had different pockets on them, so you always felt a bit John Wayne-ish when you were wearing American greens.
And were you allowed to wear American
Yeah,
greens?
there's just whatever came out of the thing that had your number on it.
So the weather was playing quite a big impact on what you had to wear, and did it affect your duties much as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when we did our jungle training at Canungra in February of 1968, we were effectively acclimatised to that style of weather. Canungra's up the back of surfers up in the hinterland, and it's the climate is very similar to that in the tropics. However, it was October when we went there, and we'd come from a winter into that environment. And I've often wondered today whether you could really get away with not giving people a period of acclimatisation, because the weather can be very debilitating, particularly humid weather. And we'd have, sometimes if we're in the base camp all the time, we'd have 3 or 4 showers a day just to try and stay a little bit fresh.
What sort of smells do you remember from that time? Sounds?
Sounds would be always heavy, metallic. One of the armoured regiments was nearby us, and their tanks went past. Every time they were on their way out to the bush, they'd go past us, and I can remember the clink, 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 clink. In fact, one of the tanks that I've seen a photo of was actually called Colonel Clink, because they made that clinking sound. Engines, always high-powered engines. Tanks had big 12-cylinder motors, I think, and APCs had V8 motors in them, and so you're always hearing things, Land Rovers, noisy sorts of engines. Quite frequently firing, you could hear artillery firing or mortars being fired, or sometimes small arms fire, generally in a distance and hard to distinguish where it might have been. The most memorable sound, and I think anybody would say this, was at night. You're laying there when it's dead quiet, and you could hear the B-52 bombers, and they're flying at some enormous altitude, but you hear this drone, and if they ever dropped a load of bombs, and they might have been dropping them 100 miles away, you could still feel the earth shake. Or you perceived it as you heard the explosion. It brought in the feeling that you could actually feel it, the earth shaking. Smells, there was lots of smells. It was a smelly place. We lived in a rubber plantation, and they used to, during certain times of the year, if you nicked a tree, rubber would come out of it, which had its own peculiar smell. We had 44-gallon drum rubbish bins around the place where people used to throw rubbish, and rubbish, of course, smells. People used to just urinate outside their tent at night, so the smell of urine. Food cooking, exhaust fumes. Yeah, fairly distinguishable smells though.
Did you get sick?
No. It's we ate army food. I didn't eat a lot of it. It was fairly indifferent sort of food. One really bad smell was related to food. They used to inject our milk with ether, which is an old it's an anaesthetic. They used to, if they ever used to want to put you out, they'd have a big cotton wool pad and they'd pour ether into it and put it over your face and tell you to breathe deeply and count to 100. And then when you woke up, you were usually violently ill. Well, they used to inject very small amounts of that into our milk to stop the milk going off in the heat, and also into our eggs. Yeah. And so sort of your first, and we had lots of chocolate milk. I can remember that in cartons, and the first sort of swig of that was, oh God, it sort of smelt worse than it tasted. It didn't taste too bad, and the same with the eggs. You sort of, smell coming off the plate.
So that's once they'd opened the egg. I was wondering how they might inject that.
I don't know, but maybe they actually didn't even do it. Maybe we just imagined they did, but everything bloody smelt different.
And was there other, speaking of using things for medicinal purposes, were there any other medications that you were required to take or anything like that?
Every morning we had to take Paladrin tablets, which were anti-malarial tablets. There's a lot of conjecture today that we were guinea pigs for several different types of tablets, and I'm not qualified to comment on whether that was the case or not, but I do know during the year I was there they were experimenting with a drug called Dapzone, which had some fairly nasty side effects. I'm one of those rare species that actually can't swallow tablets, and I'd still rely on my mother to crush it up and put it in jam. And as she wasn't in Vietnam, every morning on the count of 3 when we had to swallow our tablet, I just threw mine over my shoulder. And as we dismissed, you'd hear crunch, 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 as several other people had done the same thing. So I rather fortuitously never put anything in my mouth that I wasn't able to swallow.
Were any of the men suspicious at that time about the...
No, none of us knew any of that. No, I mean, Agent Orange wasn't even a term that we'd ever heard of. So it wasn't until after the war when people had some funny side effects. Guys came home, got married, some children born with deformities, perhaps, well, one would assume at a higher rate than the general populace.
Did you know that happening to people you knew?
No, but I'm aware. I mean, there's been enough done about it and enough compensation offered to suggest that something terrible had been done. And today, if you still look at Vietnam from the air, you can see where the Americans dumped defoliants, where still things are not recovered 35 years later.
Were the Australians using defoliants?
No, but we were victims of them, I'm quite sure.
America had as you said, a lot more people there. Was their attitude markedly different when you consider things like that to the Australian military attitude, or was it just a matter of resource that the Australian military wasn't doing things like that, in your opinion?
I don't think we would have had the technology. I mean, you can interpret it any way you like, but I don't think it's unfair to suggest that they were staging a biological warfare of a small degree. We were told, we used to watch the planes come over and we said, oh, what are they spraying? And they said, oh, they're just spraying for mosquitoes. And we believed it. Our main water supply in Nui Dat was a fairly large exposed dam, and every time a plane came over, the Hercules C-120 or Baby Herc, spraying this stuff, it just all drifted down towards the dam, and there's no question at all that we would have been exposed to contaminated water. I wouldn't have thought.
Do you think your, perhaps not cavalier, but relaxed attitude, given you felt safe in your own little insular kind of place, that you felt that was quite a good stronghold. Do you think, knowing what you know now, you would have been more alarmed?
Oh, I'm sure we probably all would be now, but I mean, nobody in their wildest dreams could have guessed some of the things that people were doing up there in terms of, you know, defoliating and trying out different medicines on us.
Do you find that when you hear other vets' stories from Australia or other forces involved in the Vietnam conflict, that their experiences sound really distinct to your experience, that they differ wildly?
No, they don't. Well, when I talk to my friends who are in battalions, their role up there was markedly different from my own. However, we were there in support of them, and they respected us for what we were doing for them, just as we respected them. We were, I mean, we all did something different. I mean, some people worked in Vung Tau, making sure that we had supplies brought up to Nui Dat daily, refuelling planes, dealing with the ships coming in, of which there were a lot. It wasn't a competition. We weren't all up there to be John Wayne. We were all up there to do what we were asked to do.
Of course, but it seems like different things were happening, such as Agent Orange or atrocities that you've alluded to that you didn't actually witness yourself, but that others saw, etc. And it seems like a different account in a way, because you seem to be able to talk about it in. It just seems a little distinct from those sort of. Were you all aware of what each other were doing at the time?
No, good heavens, no. We had a group of motor mechanics less than 100 metres away from where we were, and it wasn't until about 2 years ago when somebody showed me an aerial photograph that I said, "Well, what's that there?" And they said, "Well, that's our go-kart track." Now, for 6 months I lived within 100 metres of that and never knew there was a go-kart track there. And these guys had built themselves a go-kart. That's 100 metres away. And Nui Dat was a big place. It was several kilometres long and probably 3 or 4 kilometres deep. So it's maybe 20 square kilometres. And we weren't all mobile. We didn't all have our own car. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to either hitchhike, or if you had a mate who was a driver, he might take you there. Otherwise, you could walk if you had to go somewhere. But we weren't just scooting around all over the place.
So you weren't really provided with intelligence beyond what they expected of you. They
exactly. That was all. This is your job. You do your job. He does his job. Collectively, we all do our job.
It's a shame you didn't know about the go-kart track.
Yeah, it is. They had a golf course there too. The same group. One of the guys in it was a very good golfer. Still is.
Did the sort of wildlife and the insects and so on play a part in the sort of awkwardness of life?
Yeah, it did a bit. There were lots of scorpions, spiders, snakes, mongooses, things that we'd never seen. You'd see a snake in Australia. You can identify usually a venomous snake, but up there anything could be you don't know. And what looked like a black snake when you turned it over had a red and white and black check underside, and you weren't given a book on how to identify snakes. I've seen a photo of a spider almost the size of your hand.
Do you think you could have done with more information?
No, we probably wouldn't have even absorbed it.
Maybe if it was in a movie.
Yeah, they probably showed us movies at Canungra. I remember them telling us all the things that we weren't allowed to do, and then saying, but in case you do them, this is how you take precautions and things like that. Yeah, again, you've got to remember the period. I mean, movies were pretty much in their infancy. And although man went to the moon around that time, he went up there in an E.H. Holden, basically. So,
Can you tell us a bit about the Howitzer, the gun?
yeah, it's a big gun. Heavy, a relic of the Korean War. It was designed for use in Korea. When we first went up there, we had what they called an L5 howitzer, which was a very portable gun which could be broken into 8 pieces, and you could put all those 8 pieces into an APC and very quickly move to another site, so the enemy never really worked out where you were. Its origins were the Second World War, where it was an Italian design gun, and the Italians used to break them down up in the mountains and put them on mules, and then they'd move to another site, shell somebody, move on. They fired at the Battle of Long Tan. The battery that was up there, which was 105 battery, fired for 24 continuous hours, and the guns literally fell to pieces. So following Long Tan, they were replaced.
Did they fall to pieces as part of their design into the 8 pieces
no,
or
not
uneven
at all.
pieces?
As you can imagine, anything that clips together like that, there's going to be a lot of moving parts at the point of the join, and that's where they suffered the most after that much constant firing. There's still a few of them around. There's one up at the Keswick Museum. They've actually got a real live one there.
And what was your job in the 6 Men?
I was treated like the idiot, basically, because I didn't know much about how to lay a gun, which was something they used to use set squares and things for. No, just carrying ammunition, basically making sure that the guy who was loading it always had ammunition nearby.
When you were sleeping on dinky disposable beds and out there with those guys, did you sleep near your weapon?
Yeah, you had a rifle right next to you. Always had your rifle.
You aware of that?
Yeah, it's just like sort of putting your watch on though. It's something that's just always there. Quite funny, I actually picked one up recently at a parade I was on and was amazed at how heavy it was, and yet as young men we just carried them with us everywhere.
When wouldn't you take your rifle?
You take it everywhere. You take it to the shower, you take it to the toilet, take it to the bar, left it outside in case there were fights.
Did people ever use their guns in inappropriate ways? I just imagine if you've become that comfortable with a firearm with you all the time, that accidents are bound to happen eventually.
Yes, there were some accidental deaths in Vietnam, but whether they were caused by people being flippant with handguns, I don't really know. There was certainly, I didn't experience anything of that nature. It's a good, secure feeling though to have a rifle with you.
Makes you feel safe?
Safer.
I've heard stories of men who didn't want to be places doing things like shooting themselves in the foot to get a trip out. Did you see that kind of thing ever, or
No.
the guys you were with were there?
No, I'm familiar with those sorts of stories, but I've never witnessed anything of that nature.
Did you find your language becoming Americanised?
No, but you did start talking your own language. A soft drink was a goffer, for example, and RTA was returning to Australia, and R&R was rest and recreation. You talked in abbreviations. Everybody swore a lot. That was something that I really had to check myself when we got home, that civilised people don't, in a civilised environment, don't swear as much as soldiers do. But you did speak your own language, I'm going down to Vungas. I'm going to Vung Tau. Yeah, can I bum a ride to the PX? Yeah. Is anybody taking a truck towards the PX?
You touched on it slightly a bit earlier, but if you'd like to expand on it, you mentioned that there was an argument between the Australian and the American camp regards that the Australians didn't want to fight like the Americans. What specifically, what were they saying that they didn't want to fight like?
They didn't want to employ World War II tactics. They didn't want strength to win. The Americans just think, well, if there's 500 of them, we'll put 2,000 of us and we'll win. The Australians could take on 500 with 200 and win. And they adopted to that style of warfare far better than the Americans ever did, and possibly ever will.
Where does that Australian fighting skill come from?
Oh, I think it just comes from our resourcefulness. We've been sort of on the edge of the world for 200 years. We've had to learn to do things ourselves because there was nobody here to teach us for so many decades. We've always been a resourceful bunch of people. We still are. And that resourcefulness certainly, I think, shines out in any international stage, which is witnessed by our world sporting champions and our filmmakers and our vehicles that we manufacture here in South Australia, the wine we manufacture. Nobody taught us how to grow wine. We learned ourselves.
We're becoming an increasingly urban country, and a lot of the stories from World War II are about people's ingenuity and that they'd come from the land and they had the very basic but very important skills to survive. Do you think in years to come that skill that is especially Australian in the battlefield will continue to exist as our population moves more to the cities?
No, perhaps not as we knew it in the First and Second World Wars and Korea. No, I don't think so.
Did you feel proud to be part of the Australian?
Sure did.
Specifically, why?
Because I felt that I'd done what my country asked me to do. And I did it well.
And what was that?
They'd asked me to go to war.
Did you ever come across any Viet Cong?
Not that I knew. No. And the Viet Cong were a subversive unit. They were a less organised unit. The NVA, which is the North Vietnamese Army, were a regular soldier or a regular army. They were the great soldiers. They were the ones you never wanted to run into.
Extremely resourceful.
Yeah. Prepared to die. They could run 50 or 60 miles in a night and then attack at dawn and still have the strength to do that. They were absolutely amazing people. I missed a movie, Mel Gibson's We Were Soldiers. That's a good movie. Touches on all aspects, the home life, the wife at home. It introduces the helicopter because they became the cavalry, and it shows helicopters working up there. It shows artillery being called in. It shows the resourcefulness of the Vietnamese people. It shows how they fought, and sorry, I forgot all about that. That's one of the best made by an Australian who was born in America.
You'd be a good PR person for Australia. Have you been back to Vietnam?
No.
Is there any reason? Have you had a desire to go back?
No, none whatsoever. I've been to Bali, I've been to Singapore. I'm not particularly keen on the culture. My wife and I are fortunate that every 4 years we go to Europe and to a trade show, and then we then spend a week or 10 days visiting another country in Europe, and So over the past 16 years, we've had the opportunity to travel quite widely there, and I love that culture and the people. And I love England. England is just the most beautiful island on earth after Australia. But the Southeast Asian countries don't really do much for me. Karen, my wife, wants to go back to Vietnam, or wants to go to Vietnam simply because she's curious, but it holds no special appeal for me. There's no fears, there's no ghosts or anything there.
I suppose it was such a seminal time for so many people, given the age they were, the camaraderie, the intensity of emotions, of experiences, and some perhaps found it difficult to ever match that intensity.
Totally. There's, going out and playing football, joining a football team may well prolong that. Joining any sporting team. Getting involved with your work, if there's a good group of people at work, sporting clubs, joining a car club. I mean, the opportunities to perpetuate things like that are there. I feel very sad for the people who have crashed, and as I said earlier, they're not pretending. They have crashed, but you wish you could get inside their head and just see what it is that actually triggers it.
Have you had much contact post-Vietnam with people who you knew over there who have crashed?
Not a lot. One friend in particular in Western Australia, in the last 3 years, because I just stayed away from the whole veteran thing. I went to the Sydney March in '87, the Welcome Home parade, and that was sensational. But I have met in the last 3 years lots of people who are becoming friends, and I see all degrees of effectiveness of how they've been affected. As I said, I think earlier, that we're all affected by it, but we all handle it differently. And you don't see people like Peter Cosgrove moping around the place feeling sorry for himself. He's got too many other things to do, thankfully.
Did you ever feel guilty that you didn't see combat?
Yes, it's a lovely question to ask a bloke. Yes and no. Probably glad I didn't see it in some ways. And when I met people who had seen some fairly dreadful things, you sort of felt that, wow, I should have been there helping them maybe. But I was helping them. And, I did what I was asked to do, so not everyone's out there with a rifle in their hands.
I agree with you. I wonder, did you meet any differing opinions when you came back?
If I did, it would only be what I would have felt inside myself. I think there was a tendency early in the piece, people who only served at Vung Tau, they got labelled blanket folders, which is not a very nice thing to be called, I wouldn't have thought. But I was probably, I'll answer that question first. As we get older, and again, as I've said before, it wasn't a competition. We all did what we were asked to do when we were asked to do it, came home when we were told to. I was probably more embarrassed about being only up there for 5.5 months, because everyone else, well, at the time I thought everyone else was up there for 12 months, but I've since met people who were there for 6 weeks, people who were there for 3 months, people who were there for 2 months. Same situation as me, just put in there to plug a hole. And so what? I did what I had to do. And I would like to think that it's kept me in good shape to do what I do fairly well these days.
Thank goodness. You said blanket folders before. What was was that a term of derision?
Yes, yeah. he didn't do anything except fold blankets. I mean, he might have been a medic, or he might have filled aircraft with petrol, or trucks with water, or polished helicopters. But somebody had to do all those things, and the guys that were that term came from the battalions. We had as I said, probably the most cathartic moment in my life as a veteran was the march in Sydney in 1987. But recently in Canberra in October last year, we had they had rededicated the Vietnam Memorial. I'm not exactly sure why you have to rededicate a memorial, but they did. And so I went to that. And as we were lining up to march, and I marched with my Australian unit, we were next to a battalion. And normally, in years gone by, Anzac Day and any time you get veterans together, you always get bloody drop shorts, or a drop short is an artilleryman who lands a round a bit short. And there's always that friendly sort of banter that goes on. As we marched off, they clapped us, and that's pretty special. So so at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
When you came back, was it hard to drop the army, police attitudes that you developed over so many years by that stage? You'd had a few years of those kind of environments. Was it hard for you to sort of put that to one side and think, okay, I'm back to civilian sort of lifestyle? How was that for you?
I didn't find it hard at all. I think the disciplines that you learn in that environment can certainly serve you very well outside of it. And I would guess probably unconsciously I've modelled my life along those lines, with self-discipline and discipline in the family, and career options and decisions I make at work and with my staff. But I didn't have any real trouble at all.
Did you feel that the army at the time and now, if they're different answers, but did you feel that the army had done the right thing by you?
Oh, largely, yes. A bit hard to sort of get home in the middle of the night and be handed a second-class rail ticket to Adelaide and say, well, where do I sleep tonight? Well, that's your problem. That was a bit of a nice thanks for coming. That happened to not only me, it happened to lots of my friends as well. They just seemed to assume that everybody lived in Sydney, so they landed us in Sydney and, oh, don't you come from here? Well, here's a railway ticket. Go down to the central station tomorrow and catch a train.
What did you do that night?
I still went and stayed in a motel.
We've been talking earlier, and I'd like to get back to it a little bit, about the logistics of war and the logistics of an operation like Vietnam, just the amount of people and resource and so on. How is it that you come back and they haven't organised that when your trunk gets to Vietnam on time? And
it's part of those 7 people you never saw. It must have been enormous, particularly given the number of people they were moving around, 58,000 in total. The Navy played a huge role in that, and were largely unrewarded for it until the Keating government in 1992 awarded them a medal. Without the Navy, we wouldn't have gotten any of our equipment up there unless we'd gone to and seconded vessels from the Merchant Navy, I guess. But they did a fantastic job. Qantas did a great job flying us into a war zone. The Qantas pilots that actually landed in Saigon are recognised as Vietnam veterans too, which is good.
what were the main logistical areas that you saw that needed taking care of?
Food mainly. I mean, how do you get food for 5,000 Europeans in an Asian country. So we had food. Sometimes we had American food, which was flown in from Hawaii, and sometimes we had Australian food. It depended on whether the ships were the Japarut or the Sydney or the Burnaroo were up there at the time. So we were being constantly supplied like that. You know, just drinking water was hard to find. And everything was so dusty. Excuse me. Most people think of Vietnam as being very wet and tropical, but as a country, it's actually not unlike Australia. And when it was dry, it's exceptionally dusty. So we used to have to water all the roads down to just so we didn't all choke with the dust and get covered in it. Getting petrol, I don't know. Heaven knows where we got that from. Establishing radio communication because we didn't have satellites then. I noticed about every base you saw had a telegraph pole, and there's a pole over there, so everybody attached their wires to it, and you could see literally dozens of wires going off in dozens of different directions from one pole, and heaven knows who knew what was what. Quite amazing. How do you build an airstrip in a country like that where everybody rides water buffalo, where when they make a road, the women take off their big hats and put crushed rocks in them and spread them out, and they have a 1950s style steamroller comes along and flattens that into the dirt, and that becomes a road. What happens when a tank goes over that road and totally destroys it? What happens when a tank goes through a rubber plantation and knocks trees down because a tank's 9 foot wide and rubber's planted 8 feet apart? Huge logistical exercise.
And has that left Vietnam better off because of those logistical infrastructures?
Good heavens, no. Most of them would have been destroyed within weeks of us leaving. The Americans sort of ditched all their heavy equipment into the sea or destroyed it where it stood. We brought most of ours home, our trucks, our planes, all came home on the Sydney or the Howitzer. And to me, from what I've heard, Vietnam is no better off than it was before we went there, except it's now one country. But the South Vietnamese, generally speaking, have the lower paid jobs and are perhaps not treated as well as the North Vietnamese people.
What was the reasoning behind doing things like destroying roads?
Well, they weren't destroying them deliberately. It was just because the roads were so ill built, because they were only really catering for water buffalo and oxen carts and a little Honda motorcycle. When a tank went over it, just by very nature of its weight, they weigh 18 tonnes, I think, it would just dig up a road. So we became responsible for making better roads. And I'm quite sure, in fact, Vietnam today is a far more modern country than it was, and they do have some fairly sophisticated roadways and things there now, but that's nothing to do with what we were doing.
Your roadways wouldn't be there anymore?
No. Just even going to Nui Dat, where 5,000 of us were encamped for 7 years, very difficult to recognise almost anything other than perhaps the landmark Sass Hill and a little bit of what remains of an airfield, Luscombe Field. Beyond that, apparently it's very, very difficult to recognise anything because it's overgrown. It's 35 years.
Now, you've had the opportunity of, and the job of compiling photographs from this time, from lots of different veterans, slides that were readily available. What has that meant to you?
It's probably fulfilled an inner need to be creative in a manner that I'm able to be creative. I gathered about 20,000 slides from 80 different veterans, which was very hard to even find 80 veterans. who were prepared to part with their slides or even knew where they were. I scanned them at work, or had them scanned by my staff at work, and designed a book that we put them into. I wrote captions for them all and self-published the book, and the last 18 months I've been on the road selling it, launching it, introducing it to libraries, schools, veterans groups. We've sold over 5,000 and it's about to be reprinted. And it's introduced me to a lot of people that I probably never would have met, including Peter Cosgrove and Tim Fisher and the Governor of Queensland and the Governor of Western Australia. Keith Payne, VC, and I have become quite good friends. Keith's the last surviving Victoria Cross recipient from our conflict. I've sort of become a little bit of a spokesperson for veterans. People have asked me to speak on behalf of other veterans, and I speak at schools, anywhere, Rotary clubs, wherever people are prepared to listen. It's made me so much more aware of what we all did up there, all the different units, the different areas of responsibility that we had. I've learnt the logistics of it all, how many of us were up there, how many didn't come back, how long we were there, what we may or may not have achieved. And it's made me feel pretty good about being a veteran. It's also, the book is widely used by counselling services as an icebreaker for guys who don't want to talk about Vietnam. I get a lot of feedback from veterans' children, which is good. And the photographs that are in the book, we are quite, with the consent of the contributors, we quite freely use them to promote veterans' activities right around the country. And I guess most importantly, we've managed to give about $15,000 of proceeds from the sales of the book back to veterans groups, mainly those that have helped us, but we've sponsored the daughter of a veteran to go back to Vietnam on an art scholarship. We've donated money to help rebuild the Veterans Museum in Victoria. All feel-good things. And that makes me feel good.
What do veterans' children say when they're writing to you about these photographs, these images?
Lots of different things. Thank you for putting together the things that my father saw. One young girl wrote that she said, my father never ever talked about Vietnam, and I bought him your book and now he won't stop talking about it. Thank you. So that's good. There are lots of sons and daughters groups of veterans around the country, and I give them photographs or write to them and tell them things. And I'm currently doing a book on the Navy because I've become aware of the Navy's huge role in Vietnam as well. And that's going to be a lovely companion volume to it and pays tribute to all the people who served in the Navy.
These slides and the fact that the technology was now getting a little more portable and available, and that you could buy them over there, and seems to have led to an interesting set of memories about the war because people had these slides.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if there was anybody who served in Vietnam who didn't buy a camera there and take some slides. Colour print film wasn't widely used though in those days, so, and slide film, the integrity of it has remained intact for 35 years, thankfully. And they're also easier to scan and you get a much better result from them. I mentioned how it was difficult to sort of get them, and people have funny reactions to some. They're very private memories and they don't want to share them, although the book, I might add, is totally devoid of any foul images. It's all happy stuff. It's stuff that, as I think the doctrine of the book was it's a book full of images that veterans will want to remember, not images they'll want to forget. And but sort of coming to people and saying, you know, can I have your slides? Some people have been married 3 or 4 times, they've lost them, the kids have taken them to school for show and tell and they've never come back. Some of them just don't know where they are anymore. I thought my mum had them, but she gave them to my grandma, and grandma died 4 years ago, and we sold her house, and so on. A lot of them, when we came back, all we wanted to do was have slideshows, and so we used to bore everybody stupid, and it only took about a month before people would say, "Oh, God, don't go around there, he'll just show you his Vietnam slides." And ultimately your wife sort of says, "Look, dear, what if we take it from 100 APC shots down to 3, and then, oh, gee, but they're all good ones." And so you sort of thinned it down. You got to a point very shortly where you realised nobody wanted to look at your slides. So you put them back in their little yellow boxes and chucked them up in the wardrobe. And that's basically where, thankfully, most of them have remained. That's why they're in such good condition. But I question whether, when I've asked people, you know, can I borrow your slides, and they've been reluctant, it's almost like it's reawakening this memory that I put them away because nobody wanted to see them. Maybe they don't want to see them now. What makes this bloke think they do want to see them now? And I reckon that psyche still exists out there with the people. Ironically, having produced the book, I've probably since met 2,000 veterans who all said, "Gee, I wished I'd known you were doing it." But the hard thing is, with us, particularly being national servicemen, is we've all just dissolved into the community, and we can't be found, whereas Navy people generally tend to stick together. They belong to ships associations and they're much easier to find. But Army people have been very difficult to track down.
Do you think that the people who put away their slides because no one wanted to see them then, why would anyone want to see them now, are suffering, labouring under the fear that society is still as it was when they came back?
Quite possibly, sadly so. But those that have seen the book, and it's another lot of the letters I get, is, "You've now sent me rummaging through my cupboard looking for my slides, and I remembered how much fun I had when I was taking them," or similar things like that.
Do you think some of those people, because of the book and because of your inquiries and so on, will come around and perhaps reopen those memories to have a look at?
Oh, I'm quite sure they will, and I'm equally sure that today people would be very interested in having a look at them. A lot of us sent our stuff to the War Memorial. We were asked if we would donate it, and I know I did. I sent them 30 or 40 best slides to the War Memorial, and they've archived them, so that's fantastic. They'll be there forever. But I, from a personal point of view, being able to access 600 photographs, good photographs, in a book which show the entire diversity of the war, is probably better than having to fossick around on a website or go to the War Memorial itself, as wonderful as that experience is.
These are the images that the veterans want to remember, and you've talked a little bit about PTSD and people who are suffering today, different sort of strains of that. The images that people want to forget, were they any of the images that you were given?
Very early in the piece, yes, and then once we had a handful of shots of the nature that we liked, we started printing flyers up saying these are the sort of shots we're looking for, and that stopped the flow of bad images coming there's plenty of books out there full of bad images if that's what people want to see.
And these sorts of images that evoke those kind of reactions in people, do you think they're valuable?
The good ones or the bad ones?
The more sort of graphically death orientated or
No, good no. I think they're shocking things which just serve to remind people of the horrors of war.
Why do you think people were taking photographs of that kind of material?
Because they'd probably never seen a dead body before, or dare I say it, in some cases it was a first kill, and it's almost like a, you know, when you mount a deer's head on the wall or something.
So some of these photos are happy times, and some of them are trophies, and some of them are... Did you realise that those kind of shots are being taken while you were there?
No, I was never exposed to anything like that. Again, being infantry, being artillery, we were always about 6 miles behind the infantry, where you would expect to see those sorts of things occurring.
You and your mates, what were you taking photographs of mainly?
Children, villages, ourselves, where we lived, tents, guys clowning around, our little picture theatres. When we went down to Vung Tau, taking shots on the beach, just anything. And I mean, it cost nothing, you know, just click, click, click.
Seemed like it became a real sort of cultural thing amongst you guys to be
Yeah.
recording this stuff.
Yeah, and I don't think that was intentional. Again, as I said earlier, it's just the fact that here we are, it's payday, I've got $20 in my pocket, what can I spend it on? Well, you can buy a camera for $4, I'll buy a camera.
And yet later on, when your friend was going to Hong Kong, you're asking him not to bring you back booze or any of this kind of thing. You're giving him your what you've got in your pocket for lenses.
Yeah, I became very keen on photography whilst I was there, as did a lot of my friends. Some of them went on to become professional photographers, which was good. No, you wouldn't buy booze because you could actually buy booze at the PX.
I guess I'm reflecting on the images I've seen, and they've obviously been handpicked for the fact that they're good, but a lot of these images seem to be very aesthetically cultured images. These aren't just bang, bang, bang so much, or maybe they are, but they certainly, a lot of them, the framing looks good. They're interesting shots.
Yes.
These guys...
Well, I mean, with 20,000 to choose from, it was very difficult to keep it down to 600. But no, I would suggest that you're quite right, that a lot of these people were actually quite artistic. And the good thing, I think, was that you could rattle off a roll of film in a day if you're on a truck going somewhere, and you'd send it back to Australia to be processed. It would be back within a fortnight, and you could see straight away. And suddenly you found you were cutting heads off or feet or whatever, so you corrected that. And you had the results of you, plus everybody looked at it. So if you're out of focus or crooked or cropping badly, people would say, yeah, come on, you can do better than that, and encouraging you.
Steve, that day that you arrived back in Australia, can you walk us through your feelings, your what you saw, what struck you again as, God, I'm home? How did you get that sense of really being home?
The biggest sense was probably seeing my wife, because she came to the airport in Sydney. That made it real. But the worst thing was, I mean, there was all this air of expectation on the plane, and it was a direct flight home from Saigon. It was a wet flight. We were allowed to drink, which we did, but again, I don't remember anybody being stupidly drunk or anything. We got home and expected they came on the plane and sprayed it as they do, and as they did in those days, and expected to be given some sense of respect in customs, and it wasn't there. And the customs people were working to regulation. They opened every bag. They went through everything we had. They were painfully, meticulously slow and annoying, and found nothing that we shouldn't have been bringing home anyway. But that was one of my most vivid memories of coming home. It was very late at night. They'd closed the airport off to all but immediate relations, because that was where the war was at that stage, not popular. And my wife had rented a car, and we drove to a motel. She'd hate me for saying this, but my next biggest memory is the next morning when she said, "You can make me a cup of coffee." And I said, "How do you have it?" And she responded as if I'd had nothing to do but remember how she had coffee for 6 months, which was a bit of a jolt.
Can we stop there, Sophie? So the people at customs, there was no welcome home boys or anything of that ilk?
No, nothing at all. They were just there to do their job, much the same as I guess we'd been in Vietnam doing ours, and there was no banter between us or anything like that. It was particularly unwelcoming.
I can't imagine that if you had come back from war in Europe, the World War II war, that would have been the case.
No, I'm sure it wouldn't have been.
So at this point in time, or at what point in time did you fully come to realise how unpopular the war had become?
Probably would have taken 6 months to sort of really become conscious of that. I think just by seeing enough television, enough press. Jim Cairns had his moratorium groups rallying at that stage. There were rallies in the streets of Adelaide, and you were aware of them. But again, if they weren't holding you up while you were driving, or they weren't directly pointing a bone at you, you didn't feel it.
You didn't feel it?
No. I'd done my job. I came home and I was doing my next job.
Did you have any political thoughts, or did you have thoughts about whether the war should be brought to an end or not?
No, none whatsoever. In fact, it was as if the war wasn't even going on anymore for me.
And when you were, before you had arrived home, what sort of media reports were you getting from Australia about how the war was being received?
The worst thing that happened to us up there was they withheld our mail, and we blamed the postman. So there were stickers, there were posters, there were handbills done, and I'm fairly proud to say that I was responsible for quite a few of them, that said punch a postie on RTA, and or encourage your dog to bite a postman when you go home. We didn't take very kindly to that, but at that stage the wharfies were refusing to load ships as well, so they bought ships from the Merchant Navy in, and they had sailors and soldiers loading ships. We were conscious up there that there was resistance, but we weren't on anyone's side, we were on our side.
The withholding of the mail, who was...
Australia Post, well, obviously the Postal Union, or whatever the AWU or whoever they were, made that decision. That's rain you can hear, not my stomach.
What was the general response of the soldiers in Vietnam to the fact that the unions weren't behind them?
A lot of very indignant people, and angry people that probably set unionism back a good way with anybody who was ever in the armed forces.
So there wasn't much understanding on the part of the troops of why the unions were doing that?
No, not at all. Certainly no sympathy for it.
So as much as you knew, and with your comrades, you were still fighting the good fight, and there was good reason to be there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that good fight went on for another 3 years after I came home.
So you come back to Adelaide, and the war's completely finished for you?
Effectively, yes. And it was really 1987 before it re-entered my life, when we marched in Sydney.
That 3-year period between you coming back and the war ending, did your politics change during that period?
No, not at all.
There was no part of you that thought it should stop, it should go on, no strong opinions?
No, none at all. And I felt I'd done my bit, and whoever was up there at this stage were doing their bit, and that's the way it is.
On the day that the war finished, was there a declaration? Was there a grand announcement?
Well, Gough Whitlam came into power and said he would have no more troops going to Vietnam, and he withdrew the troops within weeks of coming into power. No, I mean, the war itself then went on until 1975, but we weren't involved in it. Our involvement ended in 1972. And it was mostly a civil war at that stage. The Americans were pulling out as well, and they were just leaving advisors there and things like that. Then there was that mad panic to get out when the North finally took charge of everything.
You said several times that Vietnam is a postcard that you can pick up, look at and put away. But still it is one of the significant postcards of your life. How did it personally change you? What did you take away from that experience, whether positive or negative?
I can't think of any negatives that I would have taken away from it. And the positives might sound a bit banal, but I think a lot of personal pride in the fact that I was of service to a country. You know, I wear 3 medals as a result of it, with pride. I love putting them on the odd occasion that we're able to, and I just feel like I've contributed something to our society.
And now you're invited out in public speaking roles, you go to schools. What do you tell the kids?
Don't go to war. Mostly things that they don't or may not have known. Particularly, everybody seems to think that everyone who went to Vietnam was a conscript. Point out that there was only a third of us were, that they were different times, that we perhaps fought for different reasons, and whether we were right or wrong, we believed in what we were doing. The cost of the war in terms of, and the ongoing cost in terms of loss of life or disability that's resulted from it. And the good times, that there were a lot of good times, and everybody, even the most oppressed people, can look at that book that I produced and laugh, and that's probably I'm getting that out of it as much as anything. Well,
I think that's a great thing to have contributed as well.
I'm very glad that I've still got the faculties and that I own a pre-press business and have been able to do it, and am able to do another one.
We've covered a lot of territory today. Is there anything that you would like to add, when given that all sorts of people will be able to access this archive? Is there anything that you would like to add that is important to you, that people should know, or that they should think about?
The only other thing that I say to children today, and I realise this may not be relevant in 10 years' time, but is that don't look upon us all as sad cases, whilst we have our share of them. of the 57,000 who are entitled to be called Vietnam veterans, approximately 11,000 have died, mostly of natural causes in that time. Some have taken their own life, but by and large, about 30,000 of us are still totally invisible in the workforce. We're contributing to society. Kids, and this is something I tell the kids at the schools, go and look for them. Have a look at your mayor, see if he wears a badge. Have a look at your policemen, see what ribbons they're wearing. Have a look at your firemen, see what ribbons they're wearing. You'll often find people in community-minded positions were also people who served in Vietnam. And we can be, I mean, at the average age of us now is 56, so we're not going to be working forever, but as people do work longer, I'm very happy to say that a large percentage of Vietnam veterans are still working and contributing to society. And we were bloody good soldiers.
You said you tell the kids don't go to war, and yet the kids increasingly are going to Anzac Day marches and honouring veterans, and they see these men and women walk past and being cheered and applauded, and they're wearing their medals. Aren't the kids going to look at those veterans and think, I'd like to get that kind of applause?
I would hope not. I would hope that they're being taught in the school that war is folly and that we are respecting those who are subjected to it.